All right, I'm showing 2:31, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Just want to formally welcome everybody who's joined us so far today. My name is Dan Prue. I'm the General Manager of the Greater Vernon Chamber of Commerce, and we are really happy to be joined by Sam Samaddar today. He's the Airport Director from YLW, joining us today to give us a little bit of information about safety through the airport, as well as where he's seen the airport come through, our last year of COVID, but what has happened, and hopefully what he sees looking forward into the future for this industry, that is extraordinarily important for our region and tourism. So just to give you a little bit of information about Sam, Sam began his aviation career at Vancouver International Airport in 1988. And in 1991, he moved to Kelowna International Airport, where he's held numerous positions. In 2008, he was appointed Airport Director of YLW, which is one of Canada's top 10 busiest airports. Samaddar is involved in Tourism Kelowna, the Central Okanagan Economic Development Commission, Airports Council International, and the Canadian Airports Council. So thank you again, Sam. It's greatly appreciated having you here today.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for having me. Good to see everybody on the webinar today. I think really the first thing I want to start with is I really want to thank the Vernon Chamber for having me. Since day one, as we got into March, and we knew that we saw the numbers decline heavily, by April, the Vernon Chamber had actually reached out to us and offered assistance in any way they could. And I must say, they're probably one of the best chambers in the Valley for the work that you've done. And both Richard and Dan, as well as the board, have been extremely supportive as we've gone through a whole bunch of different advocacy issues in terms of trying to get the message out. So you've kept us inspired at YLW, I can tell you that, and really facing some of the toughest things that we've ever had to go to as an industry. No one imagined that we'd lose 95% of our business overnight. And essentially, that's what we faced. So with that, I'd like to, with my presentation and Dan's help here, we'll flip through the pages. But really what I want to do for you today is kind of set the table in terms of what we went through in 2020. So you have a background of where we're at, and then give you an opportunity to look into my lens on where we see us heading through into 2021. So we'll start off with, Dan, we'll start off with the next slide, please.
Yeah, you got it.
And the next one after that.
Okay.
And one more, thank you. So when we look at 2020, we handled, in 2019, we handled over 2 million passengers through the airport. We saw a 64% decrease compared to 2019. And those numbers are equivalent to what we saw in 1997, believe it or not. That's how low we went. And there's a couple of things here, is that when we look at our financials for the year ending 2020, we got through the year with about a $1.4 million deficit, which we have funded through our airport reserve accounts. And we did that without any financial assistance from the federal government in any way, shape, or form. So we head to the next slide. So what we did was in March, going into April and May, we started to develop some forecasts. And what we did was looked at 3 different scenarios. The red was protracted, the yellow being the double dip scenario, and then the blue or the maroon, the steady scenario. We developed 3 scenarios. We forecast in terms of our business plan the double dip scenario. And what we found in blue is what the actual numbers were. So we were ahead of our double dip forecast as we went into the summer, and we thought, we had a very good recovery in the summer in concert with what we were expecting. But as we got through the summer, we started to see a real decline in the traffic, and I'll talk about why that happened. So go to the next slide, and we'll flip to the next one. So here's an example of what happened. Normally on a typical month, we'd see around 47 plus departures a day. So times that by two in terms of a flight. In April, we dropped down to three flights with destinations to Vancouver, Calgary, and Victoria at the time. We built up through the summer. Into October, we were up to 15, and then we saw a decline in November, and a slight increase over December. And what we did was we worked with our ski industry over the summer months to look at developing the network over the winter. And the playbook where you're dealing with a playbook with the airlines when they're looking at historical data to substantiate flights was really thrown out the window. And working with all the ski resorts, we thought we actually had developed a very, very good and strong winter schedule. And as a consequence of announcements, and I'll talk about that, a consequence of different announcements, it really scared off our airline partners, and of course, we got into travel restrictions. So in terms of the safety of the passenger, and we'll go to the next slide, what we did as an industry in the early spring is work with the International Civil Aviation Organization and the World Health Organization in really developing protocols on best practices, both in terms of the airport itself and as well as the airlines. And the industry as a whole, when we look at it globally, actually did a lot to protect the traveling public. And these measures were put in effect very, very quickly. They were actually put in ahead of any regulatory requirement to do so. So if you looked at things like masks, for example, the wearing of masks inside our terminal building was actually mandated well ahead of the health community telling us that we had to do that. And in fact, if you recall, the health community was debating whether you needed masks or not at the time. And so we had put that in, and what we did is we do what we call go through a risk management matrix. And we knew that some of our facilities could not handle the 2 meter separation that's required by passengers. And that's why we put up shields in areas. We moved towards, obviously routine cleaning, touchless travel. But the other part of our business was to look at, with the amount of reduction in traffic, is what parts of our facilities could we mothball and shut down. And that's exactly what we did to contain, reduce costs. And so we looked at every corner to do that. And we went forward with that. Next slide. So if you look at things like operational stands, we have 10. We came back to about 6 over the summer. Things like valet parking, due to the safety of the passenger and the employees, we never have opened, and we still have not opened that. And we maintained the agency statuses that we had with customer border services and others, and really closed down our ambassador program because we didn't want to put our seniors at risk or any of our staff, the junior ambassador program. We've kept that suspended as it sits right now. Where we saw the mandate, to the next slide, please. Where we saw the mandate was by the federal government was really to institute temperature screening. And when you look at the number of pandemics the aviation industry has managed, we've had about 7 of them in the last 17 years. When we look at H1N1, SARS, Ebola, and others. Having temperature screening, I'll be very honest with you, does nothing. It's like looking for a needle in the haystack. But it's a feel-good measure that the government of Canada instituted, knowing the background of other viruses that we've had. And we know from historical aspect of this that they just don't do anything for you. But here we are having to institute things like temperature screening. And you'll hear me through this presentation with my frustration with the federal government and the health agencies that have been involved in terms of a lack of a coordinated approach. So when we flip to air service, and I'm just going to take you through air service and the impacts of the pandemic. If you can go to the next slide and the next one. So we look at Canada as a whole. The traffic for 2020 was down 71%. And remember, we had 2.5 good months through January, February, and mid-March. The employees, the amount of reduction in employees in terms of layoffs was really half of our sector as we deal with airports. 50% of our employees were laid off. Reduction in capacity was 85%. In some communities, they lost all their air service altogether. So we have communities today within this country that does not have any air service at this point in time. That air service is going to be difficult to come back in the future in terms of developing the same level of capacity. And then when we look at revenues, our decline in revenues were over 55%, again, based on the strength that we had for the 2.5 months that we had gone through. If we go through the next slide, graphically speaking, so 2019 was the last year that we had, which were pre-COVID. And you can see the rapid decline in traffic broadly within the country to just about 11% of its traffic that was left from what we had in 2019. And as you get through the first 2 months of January and February of this year, they haven't been any better. We're still in this very difficult stage in terms of traffic recovery. The next slide. When we look at Kelowna, you can see that we had the strength in the first 2.5 months I was talking about, and then you saw a rapid decline in traffic, 96, 95% in April, May. We start to see a little bit of recovery over the summer months. But you look at our performance overall, we finished the year down 64%, which obviously is difficult in terms of the Kelowna's performance. But when you put that against all the other national airports in the country, we actually outperformed a lot of the airports. And there were certain months when you look at places like Ottawa and Halifax, Kelowna actually outperformed those airports. And we're currently running, when you look at a 12-month average, we're currently running about the 6th to 7th busiest airport in the country, ahead of some of the major top 8 airports as it is today. And that's nothing to write home about, but it just gives you the idea of how difficult the circumstances are in our industry across the country. Next slide. And so here I can show you the summary by sector as it relates to the airport itself. When we look at domestic, international, transborder traffic, the number of flights we had in 2019 were about 34,000. The 2020 number was 14,235, so down 58% in terms of number of flights. And you convert that into seats, we had over 2.8 million seats available in the marketplace in 2019. That dropped to 1.1 million in 2020, so down 57.8%. So the reality is you had the airlines, of course, shrinking the marketplace and the industry. The next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the political impact of the decisions. And in the spring of last year, we talked to the federal government about developing a national strategy. We didn't say we want you to open this aviation system up in the next month or 2 months, but we said let's work together in developing a national strategy on how we go about opening up air service. And we were absolutely ignored by the federal government with respect to this. And the problem we have when we look at the measures that have been taken, even provincially, where the premier said that essential travel had to be avoided. We didn't want to welcome the rest of Canada to BC. And then in December, on December the 31st, introduced pre-departure COVID testing and requirements for entry into Canada where you required testing. These things were done really without any consultation with industry. It created a whole bunch of problems. People were abroad who had traveled. We had the political side of the House saying to people over Christmas, do not travel. And of course, they themselves decided to travel. And we got into this phenomenon called flight shaming with the public absolutely resenting people that decide to travel. When you really look inside the numbers, and this is a story that doesn't get told, is that when we look at and we've been tracking these numbers since the start of the pandemic, when you look at the exposure of the virus as it relates to flying, it's 1% of the total that can be tied to international or domestic travel as a consequence of people flying. In fact, we haven't had a outbreak on an aircraft, period. We haven't had an outbreak within an airport, period, because of the measures that have been taken. And even as late as the data that I have to the end of yesterday, is that 97% of the spread of the virus has been due to community spread. 1% throughout the pandemic, 1% can be attributed to international or domestic travel. So as an industry, when we look at airports and we look at airlines, is that we've actually contained the virus. The measures that have been taken on board an aircraft, the air quality is better than you'll find in an operating room at any hospital. The air exchanges are every 3 minutes. And so the measures that the airlines have taken in terms of what they've done to clean the aircraft, the protocols they've taken, the use of masks, the things that we've done as the airport industry with respect to separation, with respect to shields, with respect to ensuring that the facilities are kept clean, the health services part. And these aren't self-serving issues or things that we did. We actually went to the Harvard School of Public Health and asked them to do an assessment of the measures that we had taken as industry, both the airlines and the airports. And they have provided us with a very good report on things that we can do and further measures that we can take to even increase the response. So the message I have for you here is that the frustration of a lack of a national strategy, of allowing provinces to do what they think they need to do, and which has bounced the virus back and forth like a yo-yo. And it's been very, very frustrating to watch the fact that you see the measures that are being taken haven't changed in a year. We see the virus numbers go up. We see lockdowns. The virus numbers come down. We see the restrictions being lifted, and then the numbers go back up. You see further lockdowns. And when you're measuring a business like the aviation business, like the airport business, that has a lot of risk, and we know how to manage risk, it's very baffling to see why we couldn't have handled this in a different way. And I'll explain a few things that we've done to handle that. We'll go to the next slide. And this is an example of the seat capacity we had in October, 82,000 seats available in the marketplace. And then the Premier made his announcement, basically saying that we're going to cut or we're going to restrict travel to BC, and we want people to stay local. You can see what the airlines did is they just pulled out capacity out of the market. They canceled routes. And as a consequence, all the work that we had done in the summer to develop the winter market really went out the window. Next slide. So I'm going to turn to looking forward a little bit, which really deals with why aviation is so important as an economic engine. And I think your businesses locally within the Vernon area have seen what happens when you don't have a good air service network. And go to the next slide, please. So what I wanted to do is just draw your attention to the investment that has been made by different governments around the world directly into their airports, into the airport industry. And the slide on the right of the screen shows the investment per passenger based on the traffic demand to the respective countries. And leading the way is Singapore at $171. United States, US is at $70 per passenger. Canada is at 11. And when you look at, and the Canadian government will tout that they've invested about 1.7 billion into the aviation industry, about 233 million of that has been directly related to airports. Most of that is in the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy Program, which goes to the top 4 airports in the country. So the government's performance, the federal government's performance, as it relates to assisting the industry, has been very, very poor. We still don't have an agreement with the airlines in place. And if you're running a business, and I know the airlines have taken a lot of heat, but if you're running a business, you don't know what the national strategy is of the government in terms of moving forward, you're going to try and keep your cash in hand. And that's why you haven't seen refunds, is because in order to stay afloat and alive, they've kept their cash to ensure that they can survive. And when you look at the passenger traffic recovery, and that's the lower left screen, the slide there, you can see where the US is in blue. So they have the highest rate of COVID cases in the world. Canada is number 24 right now. You can see where Canada is in terms of recovery versus the US. And some of the airports in the US are at about 85 to 90% of their pre-COVID traffic levels, depending on what kind of airport they are. So there's been a lack of investment. There continues to be a lack of investment. And the reasons why I'm concerned about this is if you've got the US airports, their airports have been given about $20 billion. The Biden administration now is looking at a $25 billion infrastructure program just for airports in the US. You have this uneven playing field between Canada and the United States, where the cost of doing business is going to go up with the Canadian airports because of the infrastructure deficit. And you're going to have Canadians drive across the border to pick up a flight. And that will be a loss of our economy, Canadian economy, as a consequence of what's happening. Go to the next slide. On the operational side, in terms of expectations, what can you expect? Well, mask requirements, I think, will stay in play for the foreseeable future. The health and temperature screening will be there. And we are now just starting to have discussions on a national strategy for starting up the aviation system with industry. And the problem with government right now is that they're just compiling their different departments in order to have that discussion. So something we talked about in the spring of last year is now just starting to be actioned. And what we're trying to do as an industry is let's get the domestic market going. Let's try and get some kind of growth this summer before we lose this whole summer in terms of air service, which we know that businesses are relying upon to try and get through the summer and survive. Some of the changes that we've also talked about, and we've developed these as an industry, is look at things like electronic health passports. We're already dealing with facial recognition. So the facial recognition is a form of electronic passport. It's using your face, but we don't want to get into a position where we're asking people for physical documents. In other words, we want to see your vaccine documents. And so a lot of health records now are electronic. And we want to make sure that we're using existing processes through the airport to make sure we, as we're looking at transiting international passengers or domestic to international, using those processes. My biggest beef, I guess, is that we have not yet in this country developed automated contact tracing. When there is an exposure, you're looking at doing this manually. We've continued to do this manually. And even though we as an airport, working with private sector, have developed an app that would allow for automated contact tracing, both at the federal level and the provincial level, it has gone on deaf ears. And the analogy I can use is if you have a fire, you want to put that fire out as quickly as you can. And if you're using manual contact tracing, it's 13 days, 12 days, 14 days before you're notified, and you've exposed a whole bunch of other people. If you're using automated contact tracing through your phones that are in contact let's say 15 minutes, which is a standard, you would be notified automatically. It protects your privacy. The app was designed so it protects your privacy, meets all the provincial and federal privacy requirements. And yet we haven't been able to get that going. As an airport, we're working on touchless travel so that we want you to check in at home on your device, and you don't have to touch the kiosk. You can actually just use your QR code, scan it onto the kiosk, and then print your boarding pass, for example. And then we've introduced, rapid testing, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then what I mean by air bridges is agreements by country to country on the rationale for flying from one country to another. So Canada would set up an agreement with the EU, for example, on the protocols to fly from one country to another, or in this case, the EU, which we have a standard that is global in nature and makes it easier for the public to understand what those standards are. So there's some consistent format. Go to the next slide. And the next slide. So this slide really shows the complexity of the different parts of recovery of air travel. When we look at the airlines, we've got mergers, we've got acquisitions. Some airlines have not survived and will not survive. We have the airport piece where the health screening standards are going to be very, very important, obviously, moving forward, because one of the things that we've looked at as an industry is there will be another pandemic. We want to make sure that we don't end up in this situation down the road again. So what measures are we taking in terms of ensuring that health screening as part of the safety management system of the airport and the country to country protection is still in place? You've got the environment factors, you've got aircraft being moved to smaller airplanes for efficiency, but you also have a whole bunch of aircraft that have now have been retired by airlines because of the impact of not using them, and they looked at the cost benefit of maintaining them or just retiring the aircraft. So we have a smaller aircraft fleet globally. Business travel is going to be interesting because you've got a lot of video conferencing, but how that will affect the return of business travel. And we feel that that's going to happen towards the end of the cycle. I think business travel will take longer to recover. And when we talk about pent-up demand, it's really about the leisure traveler that really wants to go and meet and travel around and see people. And we'll see that returning much, much faster. And really the booking behavior by passengers will be most likely much shorter term than longer forecasts, in that they'll be looking at deciding more at the last minute in terms of where they want to go. The next slide. And so when we look at the road to recovery, and this is the standards of the four-year traffic outlook, we look at 2021 really being worse than 2020 in terms of the overall return of traffic. And then we see a longer recovery out to 2025 before you start to get back to where we were in 2019. And part of the problems we have, and I'll go to the next slide, is when you look at the aircraft availability, the red line there shows the number of aircraft that are being retired in the Canadian fleet. The blue looks at deliveries. You can see the shrinkage of the delivery of aircraft, new aircraft back into the marketplace. And then there's a real gap between the 76-seat airplane and the 137-seat airplane. So we see this as you see passenger demand return, that you may not have the number of aircraft available in the marketplace to serve it. And if you look at the number of seats or aircraft that have retired or been retired in 2020, it's the size of an airline like Frontier Airlines in the US. So bring that back to Kelowna. We have the three models, which green is a steady forecast, yellow is the lagging, and blue is the protracted. The dotted line represents where we were in 2019. And currently in our forecasting, we are actually between the lagging and the protracted in our current forecast demand. So you can see that the longer we get into the protracted forecast or actual numbers, the longer it's going to take us to recover. And that's something we're very, very concerned about overall as an industry and as well as Kelowna. So going into air service recovery, the next slide. What have we done as an airport? There's a number of things that we've done. The first thing is that we've contained our costs to the best way we can. We're not like any other business where you can just shut down. We have to stay open for things like medevacs, for things like cargo. And even though we derive most of our revenues through the commercial passenger carrying operations, we know that as a regional airport, that we have to stay open, and we just don't have a choice. You can't just shut down between midnight and 6, for example, because we know we have, with the healthcare system, you have medevacs and things that need to get in here. A lot of the cargo traffic occurs at night, and the distribution of goods that has to occur into the region has to be available. So we've contained our costs as much as we can. The other piece that we've done is we haven't increased our fees and charges. And we know a lot of airports have, but we have not, in the sense that we want to be able to attract air service, we want to attract the airlines back when they're ready to, and that we feel that we'll have an advantage by not increasing our fees and charges. And that really feeds into the passenger piece, because if we maintain economical airfares, then they will return. And that is an opportunity for us. Where the airlines are looking at us for is they are looking for incentives, for any incentives that we can. And as I said to them, is that the incentives that we have is by keeping our fees low, that's a great incentive to have. And we do have some flexibility on reducing a percentage of things like our landing fees and terminal fees. So we have some instruments that we can use to further attract our airline partners. And from a community perspective, really what we're looking for is the support of those services as they come back. I think it's absolutely critical, because the airlines will have very little stamina to stay in a market if it's not at least breaking even to start with, and then moves towards a more profitable period. So I'll just switch, and we'll just go to the last slide here, Dan. And what I really want to end with you with is really some good news. When we look at 2019, pre-COVID, we had 9 domestic destinations within Canada. And when you look at 2021, what's already been announced, we have 12 domestic destinations. And that just shows the amount of work that the team here has done to build the confidence of our airline partners. And these are ready to go. Some of these are already in operation, but are ready to go for this summer. So if we look at Air Canada, and we pitched Air Canada in Montreal about 2 years ago about the opportunity for Montreal to Kelowna direct using the brand new A220 airplane, Airbus 220, which is actually a Canadian-built aircraft by Bombardier. And for them to have the courage to announce a brand new city pair that they've never flown before, really shows the opportunity for us in the region to capitalize on Montreal. And this isn't just a summer market. We're actually going after Montreal year round. We think it's a great opportunity as both winter and summer, a great opportunity for our businesses in the region to capitalize on Montreal, using a state-of-the-art aircraft that meets the best environmental standards of any airplane that's out there, and very, very economic to fly. We have lots of coverage into Toronto, introducing Hamilton into the marketplace. You got Winnipeg, Regina and Saskatoon, Calgary, Edmonton, and of course, Prince George, Whitehorse, Vancouver, and Victoria in the marketplace. So it's a great opportunity for our businesses to take advantage of this. Obviously for you, if you want to go and visit family and friends, that's a great opportunity too. But great opportunity for our businesses to capitalize on that. And there's obviously a big caveat on this, is that we get the inoculation rate that we're hoping for so that we can get the summer season going. And that's really, really what we're focused on. We're looking at signals. The airlines are looking at signals from the respective provinces. And if they don't see the right signals, they're going to start pulling back. So with that, I'm really happy to take any questions that you may have.
Yeah, everybody who wants to submit a question, you can absolutely submit that through the Q&A or the chat, and we'll have a look. You don't have video or audio capabilities, so I will have to read your question out to Sam. So yeah, feel free to type those in and submit them via the Q&A. Sam, I've got some questions for you. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. It's really important information to know, and it's staggering to see those comparables presented side by side, and a shame that you haven't received the financial support really low to any. So yeah, hopefully things turn around there, but we do have some questions for you. So what more do the federal and provincial governments need to be doing to ensure the viability of airports, including YLW?
So there's two pieces to it. One is really develop a coherent strategy on how we intend to start up aviation. And what's required here is to step in to the provincial domain, which is really take control over how we're going to restart the business, because you can't start a global business by having each province with different rules. It just doesn't work. We've got the Atlantic bubble, one that's happening right now. We have different measures in BC. We just can't have that happen. The other piece is really provide specific sector support. As I've mentioned to you, there's two pieces of this. There's the financial support. There's going to be a huge infrastructure deficit, simply because airports have not invested. They've really put their capital programs on hold. And so there's infrastructure investment that's required, but also sector-specific report. We need healthy airlines in Canada. If we don't have healthy Canadian airlines, you're going to see that be overtaken by our international carriers, which will have a devastating effect on the Canadian network. And part of that strategy needs to look at how do we open up international traffic. Prior to the pandemic, 50% of our traffic was generated through international traffic. And we know, even though we had a great last summer, that the spend rate of our local domestic tourists is not as high as the international traveler. And so when we look at the global network, you look at the Air Canadas of the world, it's developed on that global business. And so we need to open those things up to allow for not just passenger carrying operations, but if you also look at cargo, there's a lot of underbelly cargo that's carried on those passenger aircraft. The cherries out of this whole region are transported as belly cargo to places like Japan and China. And it's important to get those markets open.
Absolutely. So I see that a couple of questions coming in through here. So this one was a question from Ali. She says, Sam said no COVID transmissions on any flights in Canada. Is that domestic flights or all inbound, outbound flights in Canada? Although international flights have been decreased, flights were still coming from red zones around the world.
Yeah, so the answer to that is if you had transmission of the virus on board an aircraft, you would have known about it because you would have had community spread. That's not to say that somebody prior to boarding a flight or after arriving actually contracted the virus. That certainly has happened. But the industry, we've been highly responsible in that we've actually broadcast that to the public, that if you're on flight X, monitor your health because somebody on that flight tested positive for COVID. So my messaging is that when we look at the data, 1% of the transmission, whether it's international or domestic, is attributed to air travel directly. And unfortunately, the political side of this has not been very honest about that, has not been clear about that, when we know that most of the virus transmissions have been through community spread. They've happened locally, not because of international flights.
Thank you. Another asks, from the data you showed on the support amounts received to airline industries by country, is support prior to the pandemic the same or quite a bit different than the graph?
So for the most part, depending on how the airport system is structured in a different country, there's different models. In Canada, we have a non-for-profit model. So you have airport authorities for the most part that are set up. So the support for airports as a whole has been very, very low prior to the pandemic. But again, nobody expected to go through something like this. And it's really government policy that has created the situation where we have restricted travel from other parts of the world into Canada. And so that's where we have looked for specific help and resources. And so when you look at airports in Canada as a whole, we only have one shareholder, and that's the government of Canada, because the national airports in this country actually pay rent to the federal government to the tune of 250 to 300 million a year. So the government of Canada's got well over $1 billion since airports became privatized. And we're saying, as a single shareholder, perhaps you want to invest back into the airports, considering the circumstances we're in.
Thank you, Sam. What can local municipalities, businesses, and residents be doing to advocate on behalf of airports during this challenging time?
So we have actually had tremendous support from places like the Vernon Chamber. I think we have given you information. We have actually had letter writing campaigns from our local politicians back to the government. We've had questions posed back to the government directly through avenues such as question period, and then we've had direct audiences both from the opposition side, but also from directly to the minister. And so I think it's important that we continue to keep that pressure going through the various advocacy files that we have. And certainly I've been working very closely with the Canadian Airports Council in my role to continue that advocacy.
Okay, thank you. I think you touched on this a little bit in terms of your fees for the airlines, but does the decrease in passenger traffic and revenue mean there will be increased airport fees or decreased levels of service?
Yeah, so where we've decreased the levels of service is things like hours of operation, or things like our concessions, because there hasn't been traffic. What we have purposely done is to not increase our fees, and that includes the public. That's the position that we have taken as our airport. That doesn't mean other airports haven't done the same thing. Other airports have actually increased their fees just to stay afloat. But it's our position right now is to keep our, beyond the rate of inflation, is keep our fees at a low rate.
Okay, thank you. So in your opinion, how important a role does the growth in Vernon and the North Okanagan play in the future of YLW?
The simplest way I can put that is when you look at the amount of traffic that you need to support certain air service routes. The entire catchment area, which includes Vernon, is extremely important in developing those routes, because without the Vernon catchment area, we couldn't support, say, a frequency to Toronto 7 days a week, for example. So the overall catchment area is extremely important in developing the network of air service that we've developed in the past. And we know, based on people's postal codes, where they're coming from, what their frequency is, how often they travel. That's what we use as data to support our pitch to the airlines on our business plans. So it's extremely important. Without the catchment area that we have, including Vernon, we wouldn't be able to support the air service that we have, without any doubt.
Gotcha. Thank you. Got a question from Roy. He works with the city of Vernon. So what is your projections for international flights back to or from YLW?
We believe that as soon as the restrictions are lifted, where we're talking about the national strategy on international flights, that we will get those back. I mean, we're in touch with Alaska, for example, on a monthly basis. Alaska is looking for the opportunity to get back to Kelowna as soon as it can. And of course, the sun destinations, we're hoping that by this winter, that we have that international strategy that will be supporting those sun destinations as well. And, you know, it starts to rebuild a network, because if you look at direct service to Toronto versus Montreal, the advantage of having, you know, again, another major gateway is that the international service that Montreal has is different than what Toronto has. And so it opens up a whole bunch more destinations with one stop, both inbound and outbound. So if you look at the European market, we have the Toronto European market served, and also through Montreal, that it then doubles or triples the amount of international service that becomes available to you.
Another question came in from Brendan. So is the concern that Canadians may start jumping the border to US airports, is it grounded in any data from the pandemic so far, or is it more of a speculative concern if these policies are too prohibitive?
So let me explain this. 5 years ago, we faced this, and we had about 5 million passengers or people that would drive across the border to pick up an airplane. What I'm talking about is not speculative. Southwest has just announced service just south of the border from Abbotsford. They haven't done that to be nice people. They're doing it because they believe they can catch the Canadian market as a consequence of the higher costs and fares that are going to come out of the Canadian market. So we believe, we don't believe, but we understand with the aid that the American airports have got versus the Canadian airports, the Canadian airlines versus the American airlines, that there's going to be a huge uneven playing field. We know it's already there. And so as a consequence, you're going to see that. And unfortunately, again, ill thought out process, but when the Canadian government at the end of last year introduced the further travel restrictions, if you fly by air into one of the 4 designated airports, you have to quarantine at a hotel for 3 days with the further testing. Yet you can drive across the border without any quarantine measures. Now you have to go follow your quarantine plan, but you didn't have to quarantine at a hotel when you drove across the border. And I can tell you here, just locally, the number of people that drove from Phoenix, these are Canadian snowbirds who drove from Phoenix with a car rental that have been turned in here at the airport, that drove across because they're going to find the easiest path to do so. And the other part of it that we have to be careful about is when we look at things like testing, antigen versus the PCR tests versus antigen tests. PCR tests are very expensive. They take 2 to 3 days to get the results. If you're a family of 4 and you have to get tests done within 72 hours on your departure, let's say your destination country that you're flying to, and then you have to do it on your return, and that's 4 of you, you could be spending $2,000 just on tests. And we have to be very, very careful on how we go about doing that. And so, you know, we've advocated for antigen tests. It's a 15-minute nose swab, very, very cost effective. And we've actually introduced it as of Monday here at this airport, involving the LNG workforce, to show that you can do this. And it provides another layer of safety for the traveling public.
Okay. Well, seeing no more questions coming in, and we're getting close to time, I have one final question for you, Sam, and it's kind of what everything boils down to here is, you know, are you optimistic about the future of YLW and its contributions to the Okanagan?
I have to be. There's no choice. Yeah, I am. You know, we have we've developed a very good reputation in the marketplace with our airline partners. We want our airlines to be healthy, and we have had tremendous support from the community here in supporting the air service and supporting the airport. And I believe as we've made these announcements with our airline partners on the air service for this coming summer, barring that we don't have another huge wave of the pandemic, that I believe that we're going to have a much better summer. And our businesses in the region will do far better than they did a year ago.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, again, on behalf of the Greater Vernon Chamber of Commerce, I really want to thank you for your time. We value your relationship with the Greater Vernon Chamber and the North Okanagan a lot, and appreciate all the support you've given us throughout the years as well. So I'm glad to hear that you are optimistic about how things are going to be in the near future. And yeah, so I appreciate, again, your attendance and sharing your data with us and your perspective. And again, thank you all to the members and elected officials, who joined us today. Greatly appreciate it.
So much. Thank you.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.